Writing for Games is a starting guide developed for aspiring writers, not only teaching how to approach writing for games as a concept, but also how to fit in alongside the industry. Written by Hannah Nicklin and published by CRC Press in May of 2022, the book has seen very little recognition, as if people don't know who the author is. So who is Hannah Nicklin? Nicklin is the current studio lead of Die Gute Fabrik, an indie game studio that is famous for developing Mutazione, a 2D walking simulator about connecting with an ostracized community. Nicklin is also a PhD holder, studying theater and digital technology. Nicklin's book is marketed towards university students just starting in the games writing space. It runs through a list of vocab that is used within studios, what you should expect as a writer within the industry, and explains the overall process for writing for video games. As someone who has studied the games industry for quite some time and writes practically every day, I can't say this book is for me. I purchased it because I was deeply interested in seeing Nicklin's creative process, but this book doesn't actually have much of that. Rather, this book is pragmatic. If you're someone who believes that writing for games is going to be a joyful process, this book might just wean you off the whole career path. It's filled with discussion of legal documents, incomplete workflows, and having to compromise your work in order to fit strict and relentless schedules. But aside from those very adult discussions, there is solid, albeit very basic info for writing and iterating on interesting ideas for media. Nicklin takes the liberties to push and pull your attention from place to place, as the book is designed to be free flow, used as needed and otherwise thrown aside. Nicklin has marked each chapter in sections so that you can navigate easily and in a manner that makes sense to you and your needs, encouraging you to outright skip content you don't feel as though you utilize. There's plenty of great things that can be reported about writing for games, yet it would be disingenuous to let its shortcomings pass by. From the quality of the physical book to the implications of its content, there's a valuable discussion I feel should be had about this book's position in the world of authorship. There are fundamental issues with both the quality of the print as well as Nicklin's views on writing media and the world as a greater whole. First off, I believe it's crucial to talk about the print of the book and its relative price. This book retails at a steep $55. While subjective, that is a staggering amount to place on a price sticker. Writing for Games is just short of 300 pages, a paperback that's been fronted with a relatively cheap cover disguising mediocre print paper. While I'm used to this level of print in most of the books I purchase, the main issue is how the book was designed with a lack of understanding for the print's quality. First off, the cover of the book was already peeling off just after the first reading. I can practically grab on and peel the rest of the cover off. Worse though, the top 10 to 15% of nearly all pages are encapsulated in a black ink, which in of itself is okay, except that the paper is clearly not high enough quality to handle intensive printing. Let's compare the bottom of the paperback with the top. While there will be some damage because I've read through it, you can clearly tell that the top of the paperback is strangely warped, and the pages clump together unnaturally. The first impression of your book is going to be how it physically presents itself, and seeing the top of the pages mangled in such a strange manner will turn people away if the price tag hasn't already. Likewise, the formatting of the book could have used work, especially when it comes to these bullet point lists. Nicklin absolutely loves to use bullet points for some reason. It became an unintentional running gag by the end of the book. And these bullet point lists make no conscious accommodation for the page, with some trailing off to the next page, only 2 bullet points left to go. For full-on sentences, of course, the bullet points would run longer, yet for lists that only have a few words per point, Nicklin could have easily formatted these to fit into 2 columns on the page. It takes less than a minute to accomplish this effect. You can watch me do it in real time. This isn't to mention the awkward use of bullet points instead of subheaders, and the incredible amount of space afforded to them. And it's always likely these were issues with the publisher instead of being solely Nicklin's fault, but either way, the lackluster formatting is not worth $55. To chastise the print quality even further, the book is only in black and white, of course posing a challenge when trying to show anything except text on the page. The one picture that's available in the book is difficult to read. It takes an explanation from the author to even make it comprehensible in the first place. Yet this isn't done via a caption, it's baked right into the content of the paragraphs. Paragraph management, in general, Nicklin struggles with. going on drawn-out, unnecessary, and alienating tangents on diversity in games and how the workforce exploits its workers. At one point, inexplicably, the author chooses to drop the F-bomb in a book that's otherwise PG in its approach. And it's not like its use is to exaggerate an emotion, it's in a sentence arguing why you should exploit your employer. Arguably worse, however, is that the book really has it out for middle-class, cis-het white men. And based on the B-roll I've shown so far, I simply cannot follow this stance. For the sake of organization, I'm slicing this conversation into its own part, which will be touched on later. If you're no longer interested in what I have to say about the book, but rather the topic of diversity, you can skip to the timestamp on screen. Continuing forwards, another critical failing of the book is the informal tone of its author. Nicklon's work doesn't come off as professional. At the worst of times, it feels like she is just rambling to the reader, and at best, she may be having a pleasant conversation with them. Combined with aforementioned tangents and sloppy formatting, the work feels as if it's a stream of consciousness. Nicklon even admits that she pumped out this work at a rate of 5,000 to 8,000 words in half a day, which, based on the quality of the product, may not be something to brag about. The imprecise structure of the work can also be seen in its overarching organization. Nicklon does offer sound reasoning as to its design, however, asserting that there are 3 key ways in which people learn: hearing, or in this case reading, thinking, and doing. The book's parts are individually designed to address each respective learning style, yet this delineation strikes me as boring. If a given chunk of the book is unusable to certain people, the value of the work has been slashed down even further. Besides, if you're going to encourage your reader to skip around anyways, why not throw exercises from part 3 smack dab in the middle of relevant content? As opposed to shoving all the hard work at the end, inspire the mind a little to digest these exercises before tackling them on. Practice doesn't always need to be performed. Rhetoric is often a great tool for strengthening one's ideas. That's the route I took, is if I took the time to complete each and every one of these exercises, this video would have never seen the light of day. Some of these are simply unachievable for the vast amount of people who pick up this print. The inspiration here is also deeply lacking. For example, there's a 1-year curriculum available for aspiring writers to try their hand at, which is great and all, but dedicating 5 months, let alone a year, is more than enough for me. The chances that someone has completed all of this work, as I'd imagine, is infinitesimally close to 0%. Again, it's not that the exercises are outright bad, but they're placed after the book's spectacle. It's like saying, okay, we're done procrastinating, here's a bunch of homework to do. I did, however, do one of the first exercises for which I'll provide just a short paragraph. A crack soared through the sky, a combination of the wood shuffling and the breaking of my bones. The snake released my leg and fell to the ground, coiling amongst itself. My vision blurred towards the beast. After a moment's notice, I ran, bolting down an obscured path. Soon, I hoped, a fantasy-like ancient temple would erect in front of me so that I could begin my quest. I hoped, but so far it seemed like I was far from the protagonist. Finally, in the list of nitpicks, the editing of this book is lackluster. Just a few examples are, quote, "Just because a work is not plot-driven doesn't mean it doesn't relate to, understand, and nevertheless understand what plot does." That's a sentence that I would not only write, but review about 10 times before putting it into one of my works, and my level of quality isn't being sold for $55. Reedon wrote about his struggles for validation and his drive for constant, ever-so-feeding validation. He wrote about how the Game Awards were simply validation that his work was good. He was doing the right thing. However, Reedon struggled to identify with this validation. Quote, "Or I really like how the book talks about finishing up part 3, while we're still in part 2 on page 159. And there's minor errors like this all over the book. As Ink will note in a blog post introducing the game, ... For a product that I'm paying a premium on, I would expect the quality of the writing to at least be top-notch. Stepping away from the material, it's not impossible to come to the conclusion that Hannah Nicklon may be in over her head with this release. While Nicklon's CV is fairly impressive and shows dedication to her interest in writing in video games, Nicklon has only ever written one game, Mutazione. And while Mutazione is good, which we'll touch on shortly, I think Nicklon believes she is a greater authority than she really is. She doesn't even discuss many of her own works in the book, Mutazione being her only claim to fame. While Nicklon talks about plenty of games in this book, she fails to really pick apart and reference her own works, the decisions that she made. So with Mutazione being the pinnacle of Nicklon's grounding, let's talk about it. Mutazione is a simple side-scroller about connecting with a rebuilt society of mutants. Its environments are beautiful, with a construction paper design and a thrilling, dynamic overworld that is a joy to navigate. You play as Kai, whose grandfather has beckoned her to the island to take over his craft. He's on his deathbed. Along the way, Kai meets several characters who have all experienced a form of trauma and vulnerability in one way or another. The abstract of the game is to personally connect with Mutazione's characters who are mutants, who are uncanny and frankly unpleasant to look at. You've got giant green hulks with strange facial structures, unkempt sailors, residents with creepy smiles, tiny manure-shoveling creatures who discuss market opportunities, and plenty more. When you first play the game, these characters are going to be off-putting, more than Kai is going to cue you in on. The reason why it's valuable to bring Mutazione into discussion when talking about writing for games, aside from Nicklon's calls to it, is because of the way diversity is handled. Nicklon's stance on diversity in writing is that where diversity is possible, it should be implemented. The best case scenario is a cast of characters with diverse races and sexualities. In Nicklon's assessment, however, she fails to recognize that a character's background can play a lot into developing diversity. Mutazione's characters are anything but cookie cutter. The player is forced to spend time with the territory's residents in order to progress the game. Over a playthrough, the intended effect is that you, much like Kai, will slowly open up to these characters and see value where others would steer away. You relate to and feel for the struggles that these people have been through. While unhuman in their appearance, for all intents and purposes, they're just like anyone else. A core theme of the game is its characters coming to terms with this. For example, while tensions mount between lovers, Robert ushers Aelin to come with him to the mainland where they can take up a house and raise their child. Aelin is hesitant, not only because she is afraid of what the mainlanders will think, but also a mixture of remorse and not wanting to leave behind what she knows. On its own, this presentation of diversity and feeling alienated is perfectly acceptable. However, the underlining to this presentation contradicts Nicklon's ideas for diversity. Under a less charitable interpretation, one could argue that presenting diverse characters as monsters and mutants is anything but encouraging diversity. It's not the opinion I, the author, holds, but it is a likely outcome nonetheless. Worse yet, the humans that did migrate to the meteor's crash site are classified as rejects. From a pragmatic standpoint, Mutazione continues many of the stereotypes and strifes that you would see in traditional media. Nicklon asserts that it's in the writer's best interest to stray away from these stereotypes. Yet, from the cynical view, stereotypes can be found everywhere. Lonely stoner men, cheating wives, the separation of a certain group of people from the rest of society, and a black shaman? Being so blunt is necessary to get across the point that there is obvious room for criticism. Haven, developed by the game makers, released a free update in which you could swap out the genders of the characters to create same-sex relationships. However, the developers rejected the notion to do a simple gender swap of its two protagonists. These actions were in direct adversity to stereotyping its characters. The female protagonist is in more of a leadership role, being confidently outspoken and looking to adventure. Meanwhile, the male protagonist is a botanist who helps manufacture many of the game's items, and is more reserved and thoughtful regarding his actions. Reverse the genders, and these two begin to slide back into their more rigid formulas. While reading through writing for games, it's difficult to discern how much of Mutazione Nicklon came to embrace. Her account is that she was brought on relatively late into the game's development, with character designs and animations already having been completed. Instead of the characters being designed from the ground up, Nicklon needed to pair their stories to their art. I believe if Nicklon had more control over the game's art assets, it's possible we could have seen a drastically different approach to character design. Perhaps we would see less tropey character concepts present, or the game may have taken a different route entirely. Despite any alternative timelines, the recurring notion in writing for games that diversity ought to exclude anyone, including middle-class, white, cisgender, heterosexual men from writing, is at best naive and at worst a direct rejection of the goals of diversity. The book provides a lot of feedback when it comes to diverse characters in writing, and even diversity in the workplace. Controversially, it also advises that you should reject companies whose management is largely composed of white men. These blanket statements, while not outright wrong in assertion or intention, are detrimental without any qualification, and especially detrimental in a book dedicated to fresh writers. No matter how you slice it, people are people. Yes, there's bad people in the world with terrible intentions, but the large majority of people are simply trying to live their best lives. The idea that you should be inherently hostile to a certain group of people is stooping to the same level of what Western society, both in Europe and the US, has been historically trying to move away from. What it feels like Nicklon should have said is, take the time to understand who you're working for and the characters that you are developing. If you wish to move away from stereotypical archetypes in games, then don't develop characters that fall into those traps. Likewise, if you wish to promote diversity in the workplace, you really ought to see the bigger picture before stepping into said workplace. Unfortunately, a lot of workplaces are less than ideal, with media stories about sexual assault and prejudice making many people uncomfortable to work in the games industry. However, as an individual, you have the power to stand up against it. And if you believe that your workplace isn't accepting of people with different backgrounds, race, and sexuality, then you may want to consider taking appropriate action. Mutazione is a cultural experience. These people have been practically bound to each other for decades and have their own unique traditions. As an outsider, the onus is on the player to identify with and participate in said cultures. As stated earlier, Mutazione is perfectly fine in terms of diversity and the message it wants to portray. I would claim the same to be true no matter who you put in the setting. The emphasis on skin tone in class, from a published quote-unquote textbook, strikes me as incredibly unprofessional at best and overstepping her bounds at worst. Nicklin feels it appropriate to tell you what to write about. Not how to write it, but what you can write, which is incredibly irresponsible as a professional writer that people look up to. For example, Nicklin dictates that using contemporary references in media will dull very quickly. Likewise, you're not supposed to mold words to utilize characteristic expressions, like writing small as small or dog as doggo, for which I would criticize Nicklin's use of shorthands like cis and het to express cisgender and heterosexual. There's a chapter of the book, A Note on Ethics, dedicated to expressing exactly what you should or shouldn't write about. And that's pretty reductive. Nicklin goes into depth explaining that if you're clearly not fit to write about a certain character, then perhaps you shouldn't take on that assignment. Alongside this, it also recommends standing up for your fellow workers and not being afraid to fight for what you believe in. I believe that Nicklin's intentions are good, and she is clearly pushing to create a better space for workers in the games industry, but the way this is being laid out on the page isn't attracting people to take her views. People like me purchased this book because we were interested in learning either how to write for video games or learn about Nicklin's creative process. Writing for games definitely would have benefited from a lot more discussion on said creative process instead of going on tangents and trying to tell writers what they can and cannot do. Nicklin actually once said it best when providing a remote video presentation to GDC.
In my opinion, when working with any form or set of expectations, the craft is to consider the quality of the materials that you're working with. In this case, writing for interaction. Like working with or against the grain of a piece of wood. It doesn't really matter what you do as long as you do it with intentionality. You can work with it or against it, but neither of those approaches is wrong if you understand the quality of that decision and why you're doing it.
It doesn't matter what you write or the decisions that you take in writing anything. All that matters is if you understand why you're making these decisions. Intentionality is the best driving factor for creating something beloved. It's easy to create work and hope that one will simply get lucky, but if that lucky work wasn't developed with a soul, a motivating force, then that luck will dry up quickly. Nicklin also makes an important distinction regarding the motivating force behind writing Kai within Mutazione.
I think that killing our heroes might produce better narrative worlds and games. That's one meaning. But I also think there's something fairly politically urgent about destroying the narrative of heroic exceptionalism. That it allows us to tell better, more relatable, truer stories about how we live together in the world, and which begin to think through the qualities of the problems of our contemporary lives. I think one way to do that is to kill the hero and consider the ensemble cast.
In this talk, she explains how creating a generic, archetypal character leads to the conflict being contrived and the growth of the character superficial. At the end of every story, you can assume how it ends. The hero wins and likely all is well. However, there's plenty of room to write about the real, practical impacts that behold from the events of a tale. How do side characters move forwards after tragic moments? What about the average common folk? Implementing more characters into a story is tremendously difficult, but a feat that makes the world feel much more lively than without. The fashion in which Nicklin talks about her beliefs regarding character design is exactly what I wish there was more of in writing for games. Rather, the writing feels rejectful, as though something drove her towards a greatly more negative tone. She's less concise and thoughtful, rather placing her word choice to be the end-all be-all. Create your typical fanfare character and you're doing a disservice to writers everywhere. It's telling that so much of this critique is spent on mulling over anything but the actual topic of writing for games. It's simply inescapable if you wish to engage with this book on a methodical level, really seeking to apply its values to your own writing. If Nicklin were to ever develop a second edition, I would beckon her to put a lot more of herself onto the page. The descriptions on the underlying working conditions as being a writer in the games industry is very well done and a serious look into what it takes to develop a career in this field. The writing exercises, while a little bland, reinforce that consistent writing is going to be par for the course. Nicklin's documented experiences creating Mutazione are also deeply fascinating and brought me closer to a game that I actually do enjoy. There's plenty that this book accomplishes, but so much more it should strive for. As someone who looks up to the people willing to throw themselves into the brunt of game development, I want to know more, specifically about how Hannah writes for games. I want to know more about Hannah's thoughts on heroic exceptionalism, her drive to reformulate a medium that's existed for tens of decades. It's not fair to simply criticize Nicklin's thoughts at face value, because the roots run far deeper than anyone could know. I don't believe that the implications of her wording and writing for games is even fair to Nicklin, who is clearly passionate about the work that she puts out and wants people to know it well. From an intentionality standpoint, these tangents and the poor description of writing for diversity and developing around empathy can alienate potential audiences and drive people to have the exact opposite impact of what Nicklin intended. This is Creativity Inc., written by Ed Catmull, who was Pixar's standing president up until 2018. Creativity Inc. not only depicts the working structure of Pixar's creative teams, but it also thoroughly dictates the creative process behind the studio's works. The boardroom meetings to reflect over rough draft after rough draft, the feedback process, and the postmortem reporting, while one could argue that Pixar's focus scales too heavily onto its veterans, those who are given authority to direct the films, the nuanced construction and fostering of a creative environment is deeply fascinating to read about. It's understandable that Nicklin isn't throwing any softballs. She wants to depict the real-world working conditions of writers in the games industry. However, as current studio lead of Die Gute Fabrik, who strives to develop a unique, blossoming workplace, could certainly have baked as much love and care as she contains for her company directly into her manuscript. For nearly a fourth of the price, one can get their hands on a hardcover autobiography that outlines Pixar's history and thoroughly details their creative process as well as their pitfalls over the course of the company's lifespan. The print quality is strikingly better, with well-rendered pictures and a specifically printed page for colorized photos. Ed Catmull is an effective authority figure for the topics of Creativity Inc., because his methods and the culture he sought to develop surrounding Pixar have transformed it into a merger with one of the largest entertainment corporations in the world, Disney. In comparison, it's not even a competition. It's extremely difficult for Nicklin to be able to sell herself when she's not even trying in the first place. And she also lacks a lot of the authority that readers are going to be looking for, which is okay. It's perfectly fine to write about something that you aren't an authority on, as long as you know the craft. Nicklin surely does know what she's talking about, but I think the writing schedule of writing for games left it in a state with little to no polish, no mulling over her word choice. Looking at writing for games, as a concept, leaves me feeling as though there should have been more. This book, despite the simplistic and whimsical design of its cover, is too grounded in trying to convince people of how things should be better. While doing research for this critique, it became apparent that this book is inherently empty, devoid of the spirit that you would imagine from the lead writer of Mutazione. Even if this book were to be twice the length, I would have loved to see Nicklin's unique ideas fleshed out in a medium very much disposed to lengthy discussion. Instead, I have to refer to other media that justify these rants in a book where it feels out of place. One thing that Nicklin needs to remember is that book sales often happen from whose name is on the cover. If this book were sold by anyone else, it would have likely received even less sales. That's something that should be taken advantage of. These unique experiences and ideas deserve to be seen by the world, just not in the current madness they're displayed in. It goes without saying that this critique is an immense dedication to Hannah Nicklin's work, a project that took consecutive months of research and engaging with the material. Critique for the sake of putting someone down isn't valuable. Rather, whoever sees this, even Nicklin, I hope is uniquely inspired to get out there and better their works. Writing for games isn't without value, but the value isn't imbued within the material, it's everything else. A greatly missed opportunity to forge a piece of media to resonate with its intended audience. Good news, however, is that this book provides a great platform for engaging with one's own taste, inspiring one's own adventure through writing. I've gotten more value from this piece than anyone could ever know, and that alone should justify its existence. Quote, failure isn't a necessary evil. In fact, it isn't evil at all. It is a necessary consequence of doing something new. Ed Catmull. Thank you for watching.